So
okay.
I didn't really have much choice.
I see. And you?
I learned when I moved to, I was seconded from the health service to Donaldson's School for the Deaf.
Okay.
in
Oh, yes.
Edinburgh.
Oh, yes.
And that's when I learned,
Oh,
started
right.
learning sign language. That was 2000.
All right. Okay.
So I'm a new speaker, a new signer, a
Well,
new speaker.
you're both bimodal bilinguals.
Mind the conference papers are up. The conference programme is up on the 24th of June, but not yet the abstracts. I'm just trying to get that sorted out now. So
It
you
was
can
a
have a
good
look at
program,
it.
though.
Yes, it is. It'll be a good day.
Yeah.
I'm glad you can come. Thank you very much. Rosie's not coming.
No,
that's right. Elise told me she couldn't come.
Yeah.
She's in South Africa.
Yeah, Rosie could show me she's got family commitments.
Yeah.
Oh, this Scott.
That's nice to see.
So yeah, it's yeah, it looks like it's. I've been trying to get hold of Greg Blue.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to work on this finish off the study we did in
Yeah, it's a
Australia
good
before.
opportunity. He'll be doing a workshop on Friday.
And so I keep
So
saying to him,
take
like,
him
how
out
are
on
you
Friday
gonna-
night or something.
Yeah, it's like, how are you going to be here for? Can we meet up to talk about, you know?
Is he not replying?
And he's not replying to
Oh, that's fine.
Maybe it's because I'm hustling him to finish a paper.
That could be it. But yeah, I mean, I think John is taking him out on Thursday night. So if you want to do something with him on Friday night, that's sort of the end of his workshop day.
Okay,
That
yeah.
would be ideal. I'm doing something with people who are coming from other countries on the Saturday night,
Right.
in case they're staying over and want
Okay.
someone to. They don't have to, just if they want to.
I'll reach out to him again.
Yeah, see if that works. Jemina, as well as being an interpreter, is also a professor at Heriot Watt
Okay.
in interpreting translation. She's got two hats, like these two.
At least two. I think it was because the first time we met, I think, was when Graham
Yeah,
and I came
wonderful.
to the linguistics seminar, I think.
Yeah, can't remember.
I've seen you in lots of different contexts. You know, when you're at conferences or seminars and people are running around.
Yeah, we had this SUI project last year.
That's right,
as
it must have
well,
been one
yeah,
of those,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Should we start?
Yeah.
Wow, we're very precise.
Well,
Yeah, it's okay. Sure.
can I just borrow that mic?
Oh,
Oh, maybe I could. Do you want me to? Should I sign the introduction?
Yeah, if you like.
Okay, I don't need the mic then. Antonella can hand it to the mic.
I can give you the mic if you want. huh?
Okay, I'll get the mic. That's all right.
I'll be Ella.
Could you? Will you be able to do that because we have got the live feed up on both places.
I've just reposted it.
That's
both
good.
places.
Thank you.
You need the whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
I'll just and then I'll give it back to you if that's okay, Antonella. That's great. Thanks. Yes, I can.
Perhaps on the introduction you can be in the shops.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We missed out when Gladys came. Someone complained, what does Gladys Tang look like? We never bother. Yeah. Okay then, everybody. Thank you very much for being an audience. And thanks for coming today. I know there are other people watching this, and we're live streaming it. People in the UK who are interpreters. Some of them are watching it as part of their CPD. So thanks very much to Barry for live streaming it for us. The live stream link is up on our website.
Can I just pause? Because last time there were problems with the framing. When it's on YouTube, it gets clipped, and it's different from what's seen in the camera. So that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I think we're all right. There's a bit of a time lag too, so that's,
Yeah.
sorry everyone. Okay.
Okay, so at the end, if people want to tweet their questions, if they're watching online, Ben, who's on the committee, will deal with the tweets or post to Facebook, and we'll deal with questions at the end. Okay, I'm really happy to introduce Professor Antonella Sorace. She is Professor of Developmental Linguistics here at the University of Edinburgh. and she's done a lot of research around bilingualism and language development across the lifespan. Her area of research is linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science. And as well as doing a wide range of linguistic research, she also is very passionate about disseminating the results. So she has set up an organisation called Bilingualism Matters, which reaches out to parents, families, schools, communities, and has got bases in 17 different countries around the world. So we're very fortunate to have Antonella here tonight to talk to us about bimodal bilingualism and deaf children. Well, I think starting off with bilingualism in general and then looking more detail at what bimodal bilingualism looks like. So thank you very much, Antonella, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll just move this over.
Okay, so how is this? Oops.
Is it a bit
How
high
is
up?
this? Okay. And this was. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Rachel said, I do research on bilingualism, but not bimodal bilingualism specifically. So I will start by covering the basics of research on bilingualism in two or more spoken languages, and then I'll refer to what is known about bimodal bilingualism, and in the end, I'll talk a little bit about a project that is going on in Hong Kong at the moment, and that gives us ideas about possibilities for research here that I hope we'll be able to do in collaboration with Murray House. So I would like to start by saying something about what bilingualism means, because there are people who think that a bilingual is someone who knows two languages perfectly from birth. And this is not the way we're using the term bilingual. For us, a bilingual or a multilingual, in fact, bilingualism means more than one language. It could be trilingualism, for example. But a bilingual is a person who knows more than one language, two or more languages, and uses them on a regular basis. Not necessarily to the same level. So perfect competence in both languages is not part of a definition of a bilingual. So you're a bilingual whether you're lucky enough to learn two languages from birth, or whether you're a child who learns one language first and then another during childhood, or if you're an adult who grows up with one language and then learns another language in adulthood. So I'm a bilingual by that definition, although I grew up with Italian as a monolingual language, and I didn't learn English until I was a teenager. So I'm going to give you a 10-minute tour of research, because one thing that we have to do is we have to distinguish between the many myths about bilingualism, the many misconceptions about bilingualism, and the facts, so the results that are coming out from research. So what are these misconceptions about bilingualism, these myths? A very common misconception is that a bilingual child is confused. So if there is more than one language, for a very young brain, that is a source of confusion. And so many people think that a bilingual child doesn't really speak any language properly. They have like an undifferentiated blob in their brain, and they don't know which language they are actually using or hearing or processing. A related misconception is that if a child has another language, they're going to have problems at school, because particularly problems with the language of schooling, which is commonly the language of the community, the majority language. This misconception is often applied to migrant children who come from different language backgrounds, for example. They are bilingual, they bring their languages, and those languages are regarded as a potential problem or an obstacle to success at school. And then there is the third misconception, and this is not a comprehensive list. There are other misconceptions, but I'm only going to talk about these three. People think that there is a good kind of bilingualism, a useful kind of bilingualism, and a less useful kind of bilingualism, because there are useful languages and not so useful languages. So in the rest of Europe and in many countries of the world, bilingualism with the English is regarded as very useful, prestigious. It opens many doors. But bilingualism with minority languages, for example, that's not regarded as very useful. Minority languages are, for example, languages that are only spoken in certain places, only by a minority of people. Languages introduced by migration that I've already mentioned, those languages are often not regarded as very useful, and parents feel under pressure to speak the majority language as soon as possible, and often to abandon their home language. So I'm going to show you that these are indeed misconceptions, and that research is showing a very different picture. So what research shows, for example, is that even very young babies can separate their two languages. So most of this research has been done, let's remember, on unimodal bilinguals who have two spoken languages. This research shows that babies, at a couple of months certainly are able to distinguish their two languages. But there are some studies that show that even newborns, if a newborn heard more than one language in the last few months of pregnancy. So for example, if the mother spoke more than one language in the last few months of pregnancies, when the fetus can actually hear quite a lot of what goes on in the environment, that baby comes to the world with a special sensitivity to those two languages. So quite a long way from the idea of early confusion or lack of differentiation between the two languages. When we look at the way language develops in monolingual children or in bilingual children, we find many more similarities than differences. So we find very similar stages, a sequence of stages that both bilingual children and monolingual children go through. Similar milestones of language development. There are also some differences because it's not exactly the same to learn more than one language and learn only one language. But by and large, there are many more similarities than differences. What we know from research is that bilingual children have a better understanding of how language works in general. And I'm saying know how language works in scare quotes, because I don't mean that they know they can recite the grammatical rules of the language, which is what we commonly understand by knowledge of grammar, knowledge of how the language works, the way we adults study a language in a classroom, for example. I'm talking about an implicit understanding of how language works, So a spontaneous understanding of how language works at the level of sounds, at the level of words, and at the level of sentences. And because of this implicit understanding of how language works, many bilingual children are better language learners. So once you have more than one in your brain, it's easier to learn a third language or a fourth language. Other languages are easier to accommodate. And there is an increasing number of studies that shows that bilingual children potentially have a better understanding of the majority language. So, for example, the language of schooling. Remember that one of the misconceptions is that a bilingual child may have a problem with the majority language, the language of schooling. I still remember one of my son's teachers. My sons grew up with English and Italian from birth, and they were always very good at English. They were in the top class for English throughout their school career. We went to talk to the English teacher of one of my sons, and she didn't know that my son was bilingual. And when we told her, she was really surprised. You know, it came out of her heart. She said, "Really? He's so good at English." And that says it all. That says that the expectation was that if there is another language, you can't be that good at English. But research is showing otherwise. We know that when bilingual children seem to mix their two languages, mixing is not necessarily a sign of confusion. Because, first of all, mixing has a grammar. So there are rules of mixing. You can't mix randomly. You can't just take words from another language and insert them in a sentence at any point. So there are only specific points where you can do that. So there is a grammar of mixing that children learn. And that's the same grammar that is then used by adult bilinguals when they mix their two languages. And this is also relevant for what we're going to say about bimodal bilinguals. Mixing can be creative because it can improve the message that children are trying to get across. That's an example from one of my children. That in Italian means, "Mommy, are we going to eat crunchy potatoes tonight?" Now, what is curious about that sentence is that cruncioso doesn't exist in Italian. It's totally made up on the basis of the English word crunchy. But if you look at how that sentence is formed, it's a perfect sentence of Italian. Crunciose agrees in gender and number with the noun it refers to, so potatoes. They're both feminine, plural, patate, crunciose, right? Crunciose follows the noun as it should in Italian. It doesn't precede the noun as it should in English. So that's a piece of mixing that shows very good command of Italian. And I could show you examples in the other directions as well, but I won't. So that mixing improves the communication. Now, we still talk about patate crunciose, and my son is 22 now, and it's a very good recipe for potatoes. In case you're interested, I can give it to you. We know that bilingualism, research has shown that bilingualism can give advantages for literacy. So, for example, for reading, if the bilingual child has a sufficient vocabulary, so that is a condition, then there are aspects of reading skills that can transfer from one language to the other. So, for example, research on reading alphabetic languages, like English and Italian, all languages that use an alphabet, even if it's not the same symbols. So Russian is an alphabetic language, Greek is an alphabetic language, but they use different symbols. in all alphabetic languages, children have to understand that there are correspondences between printed letters and sounds of the spoken language. So graphemes and phonemes in technical terms, and unless they've made that discovery, they are not reading, really. So that discovery is facilitated in bilinguals because of this, as we said, this enhanced awareness of the sound, the structure of sounds of the language. So once the child learns to read in one alphabetic language, they don't have to redo the discovery in another alphabetic language. They can simply transfer it from one language to the other. There are benefits outside the language domain that are very interesting. So, for example, bilingual children have been found to have an earlier understanding that other people can have a different perspective or a different point of view from their own. This is a very well-known milestone in cognitive development in all children. So children have to gradually decentralize, so they have to move from thinking of that they're the center of the world, essentially, to understanding that you can have a different perspective. And so if you're sitting there, you can't see, for example, what I'm seeing here. If I'm not putting you in a position to understand what I'm talking about, then you can't understand what I'm referring to, and so on and so forth. So bilingual children have an earlier understanding of this different possibility of different perspectives because they know that not everybody is bilingual. They discover that not everybody is bilingual. And so there are monolingual speakers of language A, monolingual speakers of language B, and bilingual speakers like them. And so they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. And so they have to understand, they have to step out of their linguistic shoes, so to speak, and understand that, the other person may be different. And this is extended to other domains that are not just linguistic. Finally, there are effects of bilingualism on attention. So how people pay attention to whatever they're doing. We all have to pay attention to what we're doing, otherwise we don't do it well. And we have to pay attention in a selective way, so we have to pay attention to what matters for what we're doing and ignore what doesn't matter or what is irrelevant. So bilinguals are better at paying focused attention and at the same time ignore what is irrelevant or unimportant for the task they're doing. And that is a sign of a better mental flexibility for dealing with conflicting information, and also a better ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that, as I'll say in a minute, in all bilinguals, both languages are simultaneously active. You can't turn off a language with a switch because you don't need it. So every time a bilingual uses one of their languages, they have to block out or inhibit the other language or languages that they know. So I'm speaking English to you, my Italian is very much active in my brain, as well as the other languages that I speak, and I'm constantly pushing them away. And this constant experience of inhibiting the language that you don't speak, that it has effects outside the language domain. As we'll see, this is slightly different for bimodal bilinguals. There are longer-term benefits for aging. So some research shows that being bilingual is a kind of cognitive reserve that can slow down the decline of mental functions, both in normal cases everybody ages in that respect, and people can compensate in different ways. And also in pathological cases, so certain kinds of dementia, the symptoms, the first symptoms of the disease appear on average 4 or 5 years later in bilinguals compared to monolinguals. Clearly, this doesn't mean that if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's, which is unfortunately a misinterpretation of the research. It means that the first really invalidating symptoms, the symptoms that unfortunately, deprive a person of their autonomy, show up 4 or 5 years later, which is an enormously long time in terms of autonomy, but also public health. So these benefits are not always automatic, so they're not found in all bilingual children. It's interesting that the studies that don't find these benefits, they simply don't find a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. There are basically no studies that show a disadvantage for bilingualism, so that bilinguals are worse than monolinguals. The fact is that there are many other factors that can play a role. So the question is, what do bilingual children need in order to get these advantages? One thing they need is exposure to both languages. So an engagement in both languages. So children don't need language lessons, okay, in a way that an adult may appreciate language lessons. They need to hear the languages in situations, hear or be exposed to the languages in situations that they find engaging, that they find motivating to use the languages. Possibly bilingual children need to hear both languages, or hear or be exposed to both languages by several speakers or users. So in many bilingual situations, the minority language is heard from one person, the parent who uses that language. We know that variation, so people using languages, speaking in different ways, signing in different ways, I think, in sign language, is very important. No two people are exactly the same in the way they use the language, and that normal variation is very important from the point of view of language development, because it allows the child to realize what is possible and what is impossible in the language. So having a community around that speaks both languages is very important. And finally, positive attitudes. As I said before, there is a privileged kind of bilingualism and a less privileged kind of bilingualism. Children know that. Children realize that very, very soon. If people think that, either one of their languages is not particularly nice or good or useful, they know that, and they are not motivated to use it, quite understandably. So positive attitudes are very important, both in the family and in the community. And from everything that I said so far, which is a summary of research on unimodal bilingualism in spoken languages, it follows that it doesn't matter which languages the bilingual child uses or learns, because it's the fact of having more than one language in the brain that matters, not which languages these are, how many people use these languages, whether they're prestigious languages or not. Let's remember that prestige is given by socio-political, economic power associated with a particular language. But the brain doesn't know that. The young brain doesn't know that. It discovers the importance attached to particular languages. But from a cognitive point of view, there are no useful or less useful languages. So bimodal bilinguals. So bimodal bilinguals are bilinguals who have a spoken language and a sign language. So they can be hearing children of deaf parents, so the so-called coda children. They can be hearing adults who learn sign language as a second language, and there's many adults like that. They can be deaf children with a cochlear implant, for example. So there's different categories of bimodal bilinguals, and I think it's fair to say that we don't have enough research on all these categories to be able to say that there is a difference among them. Because research on bimodal bilingualism is not as advanced as research on unimodal bilingualism. And by the way, there is a new trend in research on unimodal signers, so users of two sign languages, either from birth or one first and then another. Those are unimodal signers. So we need more research that compares bimodal signers with unimodal signers and unimodal speakers, or bilingual speakers. So same modality as opposed to different modalities. So summarizing, bimodal bilingualism has been found to share some of the benefits and linguistic and cognitive benefits as unimodal bilingualism, but other benefits are specific to bimodal bilingualism, and they're not shared with unimodal bilingualism, because some benefits are related to the experience of using a sign language that has a visual modality. So it has been found that, for example, as we said before, reading abilities, deaf children who are good at a sign language, they're also more skilled readers. And because it seems that good reading abilities are based primarily on proficiency in the primary language, whether spoken or signed, it doesn't matter. So those are some references on this. It has been found that being a proficient writer also in unimodal bilingualism in deaf signers who are proficient writers in another language, that also can give mental cognitive flexibility. Again, it's not very many studies, but it seems that the association of a sign language and strong literacy in another language can also provide this better cognitive flexibility. I mentioned perspective taking before, and it has been found by some studies that bimodal bilinguals also have a better awareness of other people's mental states, so other people's perspectives, and they understand that it is possible to have other perspectives at an earlier stage, like unimodal bilingual children. There is one crucial difference between bimodal bilingualism and unimodal bilingualism. And the difference is this. In bimodal bilingualism, the two languages can be produced and heard and processed at the same time. This is what researchers call code blending, because there is no competition for articulatory channels. Right? A unimodal bilingual can only produce one language at a time. It's not possible to speak Italian and English at the same time because there is only one articulatory channel and one channel to perceive the languages. But for bimodal bilingualism, because of the different modalities, there is no competition between the channels. So it is possible for bimodal bilinguals to produce and hear both languages at the same time. And this has important consequences for some of the cognitive effects that I mentioned before. So what has been found by research on bimodal bilingualism is that there is a range of positive effects on visual spatial abilities that these advantages are found both in deaf and hearing bimodal bilinguals. For example, better orientation, better peripheral vision, better face processing, face recognition, face processing skills, enhanced spatial memory. So these effects are clearly, specifically related to exposure and competence in a language that uses the visual spatial modality. They're not found in unimodal bilinguals who have two spoken languages. At the same time, research has found that bimodal bilinguals, by and large, don't have the advantages for attention and the ability, if you remember, we talked about the ability to focus attention and exclude or inhibit irrelevant information. And if you remember, that specific effect is due to the fact that in unimodal bilingualism, bilinguals have to inhibit the language they don't use. Because they are both active at the same time, they can't be produced together simultaneously, and so it's necessary to inhibit the language that is not used. Bimodal bilinguals don't have to do that. We've just said that. So these effects that are related to the fact that to the exclusion of the language that is not used in unimodal bilinguals are not found in bimodal bilinguals because they don't have to do that. And in fact, there is research, that actually shows that they could do that. Bimodal bilinguals could also inhibit one of the languages, but it has been found that by and large, they don't do that. And that has very important implications for models of bilingualism that would take me too long to go into. But it's very important information that shows that, if there is no constraint, then there is no need to stick to one language. In fact, some researchers said that, unimodal bilinguals would also do this if they could. So they would also code blend, but they can't because it's impossible to produce both languages at the same time. So these executive control advantages for attention tend not to be found in bimodal bilinguals. It doesn't mean that bimodal bilinguals are worse, remember. It just means that there are they're not better than monolinguals. Now, there is more recent research that actually questions this. For example, researchers are asking, well, is it really true that bimodal bilinguals don't use inhibitory control? So they don't have to inhibit one of the languages. It has been argued that in auditory word recognition, for example, inhibitory control is involved in bimodal bilinguals as well. So they have to engage these non-linguistic inhibitory control processes in comprehension, perhaps not in production, but in comprehension, possibly not to the same extent. So it may be a matter of degrees rather than, bimodals don't use it and unimodals do. But we need more research. Clearly, there is a lot of variation in individual experiences of bimodal bilingualism, as well as in individual experiences of unimodal bilingualism. And this individual variation needs to be factored in. It needs to be better understood. Not all bilinguals are the same, because bilingualism, as I said before, is affected by many, many different factors. And also, there is the open question that these effects on visual spatial cognition in bimodal bilinguals that we mentioned before could actually interact with more general cognitive effects. The typical tasks that are used in research on unimodal bilinguals to test the control of attention, for example, are visual tasks. So they are tasks where you have to distinguish between different colors. Are you familiar with the Stroop task? Yeah? The Stroop task is a task, I don't have an example here, but you see names of words that say colors. So red, green, blue, black, but the words are written in a color that is not the same as what the word says. So the word red is written in blue. The word black is written in white. And people have to name the color of the ink. So they have to say blue when the word says red. So there is a clash, and they have to apply their inhibitory control. Now, that's a visual task. And if bimodal bilinguals are better at visual spatial abilities, well, that could actually, provide an advantage for them to perform in a task like the Stroop task. So there are interactions that are not properly understood, and perhaps it's not entirely correct to say that there are no benefits of bimodal bilingualism on the control of attention. So if obviously British Sign Language or any sign language is a language that gives these benefits, bilingualism in a sign language shares many of the benefits and characteristics with hearing bilingualism, and so I think it's fair to say that any initiatives and programs that can raise the status of BSL or any other sign language are very important. And we also know that sometimes, parents think that a cochlear implantation can solve the problem in their deaf child, but we know that that's not always true, that cochlear implantations can improve hearing, but they're not a cure. And so often a cochlear implant fails to achieve, the desired effect. And so it's important for a child to learn a sign language, for a deaf child to learn a sign language as soon as possible and enjoy the benefits of bilingualism. And that's where this program that my colleague, dear friend, and ex-student, believe it or not, Gladys Tang did a PhD with me many years ago when I was a temporary lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. And she started this amazingly successful program, co-enrollment program, so-called Sign Bilingualism and Co-enrolment in Deaf Education program in Hong Kong, that really is proving to be very successful, very important. It's gained a lot of recognition in education, in the media, and so on. So one of the principles of this program is that sign language is introduced very, very early on. And it's introduced among hearing children as well. Remember that a baby can learn a language very, very easily. So there are, in Hong Kong, they're doing baby signing programs, early sign bilingual reading programs. It has to be remembered that 95% of parents of deaf children are hearing, and they don't necessarily know sign language. So introducing sign language as early as possible to both deaf children and hearing children. And the second principle of this program is to work together. So deaf children and hearing children are in the same environment, so hence co-enrollment. And deaf children and hearing bimodal bilingual teachers work together. They work together in the classroom. And the advantages of their working together, the deaf teachers, first of all, provide a cultural model, a deaf cultural model. They can introduce students, children, teachers to the language, the culture of the deaf community. They can organize, the deaf cultural activities in the schools, and they also teach sign language, Cantonese sign language in this case, to the teachers, to the hearing students, and to the parents. So co-teaching is a very important feature of this, this model. Teachers work together, hearing teachers and deaf teachers work together to plan classroom activities, to construct teaching materials, and to deal with the teachers, with the children. So they supervise together both deaf and hearing children and their classwork. And the children learn together. I've seen videos of this program, and perhaps some of you saw videos of this when Gladys came last year. Co-learning is very successful in these schools. So children really communicate with one another in a very smooth way. And that means that there are positive results for all kinds of measurements and parameters. So it has been found that the development of Cantonese Sign Language improves in these co-enrollment programs. It has been found that literacy in written Chinese is better in these co-enrollment programs, as well as oral language development. And as I said before, social integration, children really work together. Classroom participation is very high, both in deaf children and in hearing children. So there are data that show this that I don't have time to show you in detail. So this is a very successful example of blending sign language in normal schools and having hearing and deaf children working together. It's a very successful program that shows that teaching sign language at an early age is very beneficial, not just for the deaf children, but also for the hearing children. And that bimodal bilingualism can really be a very successful avenue and can benefit all kinds of aspects of the curriculum. So I'm just about to conclude just by saying that one of the problems in dealing with bilingualism, both unimodal and bimodal bilingualism, is that people need more information. Because if people have more information, they can make better decisions. They can make informed decisions rather than decisions based on misconceptions and myths. And that's why we are trying to bridge the gap between research and different sectors of the community. And this is why I founded Bilingualism Matters several years ago, which is now a center at the University of Edinburgh. It has a presence in the community where we work with the public sector as well as the private sector increasingly. We are engaged with policymakers. We are often in the media, and we have a large international network. We have 15 branches in Europe, in 10 different European countries, and we're growing in North America. We have 2 branches at the moment, but we will soon have a 3rd in September in California. I'm negotiating with other 2 North American states. And we are also negotiating with Hong Kong in China. So having this large international network allows us to compare experiences as well, compare how people deal with bilingualism at different levels, in different sectors of society, in different political systems, in different countries. And we can also share good practice. We deal with early bilingualism in preschool and primary school years, both typical and atypical bilingualism. We deal with immigrant children, so bilingualism and language learning in immigrant families, where, as I said, many families think that their language is problematic, and so they force themselves to switch to the majority language. We deal with bilingualism in minority languages. We do a lot of work on Gaelic here, but we do also work with minority languages in other European countries. And increasingly, we deal with bilingualism later over the lifespan. I'm fortunate enough to collaborate with colleagues who specialize on aging, for example, and so we can work not only on young adults, but also on much older adults. We have a series of partnerships and collaborations, Scottish Government here, several councils, several charities in Scotland, but also the NHS, also the Financial Times that helps us to deal with the private sector and businesses. And we have a number of projects, many of which are funded by the European Commission, and I certainly hope that this will continue to be possible given the situation and the uncertainty for the future. We also have some projects funded by the National Science Foundation in the States. We have at the moment a large European project called ATHEME that involves 8 different European countries and 27 institutions, where we look at different aspects of bilingualism, both from a linguistic point of view and from a cognitive point of view. So I'd like to thank my good colleagues and friends who specialize on bimodal bilingualism, and I've learned a lot from them. One is Karin Emery from California, San Diego State University, and the other one is Gladys Tang, that I mentioned before, from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm ready to answer questions. Thanks.
Okay, so would you like to have a short break now and then come back for questions? Maybe 3 minutes so that we can keep going. And people who are out there watching, this is the time to get tweeting or go on Facebook. Ben is dealing with the incoming questions. So we'll try to include people who are watching live. Thank you very much, Antonella. It was a really interesting talk. We'll just have a short break now before the questions.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Yeah.
People do like
What?
to do this. We do get a lot of questions coming in when we do this.
Really? Okay. I refuse to use Twitter because
Never mind. No, they're watching on.
I started doing Bilingual Matters because that seems to be your thing.
Yeah.
So just follow people.
Yes. Now my team at Bilingualism Matters do Twitter.
They do that bit.
I
If
just.
they notice that like it's a bit rubbish or
No,
that I haven't
don't
done
worry.
something right, then
Oh, don't worry.
that's why.
Yeah.
Okay. How
No,
do I know if somebody's
Twitter
done
would eat
this?
up, the remaining time that I have.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it's just.
right.
I know it's scary.
I would be really scared.
Same with Facebook, but we do get a lot of very good feedback from people watching on Facebook, so it's obviously worth doing.
Yeah, no,
it for things
Facebook
like
I
this.
do, but Twitter, I know that I would have a lot of followers. And,
Twitter, do you know? What do you mean about? I don't know what I'm doing. Like if somebody tweets, that's what I'm trying to do. How will it
If
come
they
up?
tweet questions, will it come up
Will
on
it-
your own phone?
Will it come? How will it come up? How will I know?
One of the things things which I've just ordered a new ebook for
Yeah.
the library by Ruth Swanwick, talking about language and translanguaging, which is all about deaf children.
Yeah, I mean, this term translanguages, I mean, I really don't
Well, the
like
book is
it.
there anyway. No, I don't like it. But I don't like it because
It's very fashionable. And,
yeah, I category. Yes, code switching is
Yeah.
right for me. Anyway, one of the issues in the book, if you have a quick look at it, is it concentrates an awful lot on what the children are doing and not very much on the input or the quality of the input.
No, right.
Which is what I'm most concerned about. Because I think it's very nice to say that teachers can do this. Of course they can. But if they don't have very good BSL to start with, so that's an issue for deaf
Yeah.
children. That's the question I'm going to ask you, which is about how children can understand the differences if they see sign supported English and then they see British Sign Language.
Yeah.
How they're meant to work out what's happening because they don't know, and often the person who's doing it doesn't know either.
Yeah.
It's one of the main problems.
But that's why, you know, being exposed to different people, you know, with even different abilities in sign language, I think, you know, that's, I mean, you know, bilingual children being exposed to native and non-native speakers, you know, at different levels of competence. As long as they hear it, they see it, you know, from different people, they don't automatically, you know, learn the mistakes or the. So that variation that I mentioned is very important. Yeah.
Are you ready for your questions? Are you ready out there with your tweeting?
Okay.
Yep, come on up.
Can you look that way just so that we can get the voice over?
I think you were talking, you were explaining about the topic about very young babies being born, and when parents recognise that the child is deaf and parents who are hearing, and some of the issues that come up against that. And I was wondering about the language role models that those deaf babies would have in children in the community, because they don't have deaf parents. Typically those hearing parents will not know sign language. So who are the role models for those very young deaf babies that are born to hearing parents? Who can teach them sign language?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that early diagnosis is essential, right? And this was a problem until fairly recently. So, you know, hearing parents don't expect their children to be deaf, and it's very hard, you know, to realize that a child is not hearing. And if that happens, the child is deprived of input, because obviously, you know, they can't process spoken language, and they are not getting sign language either. That's why early testing, you know, which is now widely available, is very important. But previous research actually showed that deaf children who were undiagnosed until fairly, you know, much later, actually missed out on language development, because the very first period of life is very important from the point of view of language development. A child needs to get input in any language, but input in a language in order to develop language properly. If there is no input in that initial stage, then language development can be compromised. So I think, you know, once there is obviously a certainty that a child is deaf, then, you know, early introduction of sign language is very important. And then, you know, that may or may not go together with cochlear implants and so on, but sign language is very important. The parents have to learn it too, because if hearing parents can't use sign language, so it's important for them to learn it too.
I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about code blending, because I have to say from my personal experience of learning sign language and in an interpreting course where we should be using our memory even more, I found that at a word level, code blending is definitely possible, but once you get up to a whole sentence, I can't do it. I really struggle.
Yes. Yes, there is a lot more to be said about code blending. First of all, code blending involves semantically coherent messages, right? It's not that you sign one thing and you speak, you say a completely different thing. So there is coherence, from a semantic point of view, and it's easier to identify the phenomenon at the lexical level than at the sentence level, where, for example, word order, the word order of the spoken language may be different from the word order of the sign language. And so, how code blending works at that level is an open question. The point is that again, maybe it's a matter of degree. Bimodal bilinguals don't really need to block out one of their languages when they're signing. They don't need to block out their spoken language, and vice versa, to the same extent as unimodal bilinguals might do. But there are differences. You're perfectly right, between the lexical level and the sentence level. Anything on Twitter?
Have you got anything in?
Check. Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, I'll just ask a question.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I'd just like to ask a question about the separation of languages, a bit linked to the last question, because I think for many deaf children, they don't necessarily understand that there are two languages going on. They sometimes, if they have good access to hearing, yes, they can hear the English, but they might be seeing sign-supported English, which is English plus signing in English order, and they might at other times, maybe in the same classroom or nursery, see British Sign Language. And I just think that the separation of languages, which you talked about early on, must be hard to establish.
That's a very good question, and I really don't have enough, elements to give you an answer. But it's definitely a good question. So what you're suggesting is that, unlike a unimodal bilingual child, where there is evidence that they can really separate between the two languages, for a bimodal bilingual child, it might be more difficult. Yes. 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 Definitely a question that I think needs more attention and more research. Yes.
Again, kind of linked to that question.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning the importance of early language input for children, but with deaf children, what happens if you have hearing parents, and then maybe the hearing parents learn sign language, but obviously they're not native speakers, they might not even be fluent, so the input the children get will not be of a very high quality.
Yes, that's a very interesting question that arises for unimodal bilingual speakers as well. So the question is, would a child who is exposed predominantly to low-level, non-native input, how much can that child learn? And there is certainly some research that shows that if a child hears predominantly this very low-level, non-native input, and just that, they don't really progress very rapidly, and it's more of a disadvantage than an advantage. However, if a child hears the language not only from low-level, or learners of the language, but also from other speakers. So this goes back to the point I was making about variation and being exposed to more than one speaker, speaking in different ways. Then the child doesn't automatically learn the mistakes or the non-nativisms, etc. So yes, there is a risk that in a deaf child, who's learning sign language predominantly from parents who are learners themselves, learners of sign language. So it is important, in principle, to give access for that child to hear the language from other users of sign language, other signers. It's not always possible, I guess, but it would be important in principle. As long as there is variation, I don't think there's any reason to worry about the child automatically acquiring characteristics of this speaker or that speaker or that speaker. That's why variation is important, because children regularize, but in order to regularize, they need exposure to different speakers.
I think we have a comment from
Yeah.
the online observers. Yeah.
Right, from Toby Dawson. Wouldn't the emphasis on mixing a spoken language and a signed language make it likely that heritage becomes diluted?
That heritage becomes diluted. You mean that the sign language may be less, I mean, the transmission of a sign language from one?
I'm not sure what he's just...
Yeah.
I think he's talking about the cultural elements of bilingualism.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that it might be watered down or not there. Knowing Toby is a little bit, not much.
Well,
Right.
there's the cultural aspect and there's a linguistic
Yes,
aspect
yes,
both. So
yes,
maybe you could
yes,
talk about both
yes.
of those.
I mean, definitely there is a cultural aspect and a linguistic aspect. I personally think that a lively language is open to the influence of many different things. Okay, if a language is actively used, by several people, many people, then it absorbs, various characteristics and differences. So I don't think that we should worry too much about that. That is a worry that arises for minority languages, for example, right? I mean, minority languages where there's often, this ideal of the language as it ought to be spoken, the language as it used to be spoken, and also, the cultural characteristics, but particularly the language, this idea that there is a pure version of the language. And so new speakers, for example, or non-native speakers don't speak the language well, but also well enough according to this idea. But also that has an effect on the confidence that speakers have towards their own language abilities. So, I understand, I think I understand where the point comes from, but I think that perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about that. That there are more advantages in having a wider range of speakers and users than disadvantages. Another one?
No, I think that's I'm trying to figure out how to post something with that on Twitter. It's just
So you talked about the project in Hong Kong and the co-enrolment program, the signed bilingual co-enrolment program, and you mentioned that there's a lot of mixing. So do you mean with deaf and hearing children, like the deaf and hearing children mix. So the hearing children are learning to sign as well. Can I just clarify that?
Yes, yes, the hearing children definitely learn to sign. And they learn even in the preschool years. So they learn earlier and earlier. So by the time they start school, they know how to sign. Children learn languages very easily, as we know. So hearing children can use sign language very well. And so they can communicate with the deaf children by signing, and they communicate with the hearing children by speaking. So. Thank you. Anything else coming up on Twitter?
I think that's it. Facebook's quiet.
Okay.
We will have statistics later.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'd really like to thank you, Antonella. We could talk for a lot longer about this subject. I mean, how difficult it is to organise good quality input in the very early years. The fact that many deaf children aren't using both. They are, many of them, using both modes, but some of them aren't. So there's lots of many interesting issues to discuss, but we'll have to leave it till a later date. But I'm really pleased that we've had, this is our second input this academic year on co-enrolment as an idea. And I think that you will also be able to read, if you're a University of Edinburgh student, be able to read about it, because Gladys Tang's book is in the University Library as an e-book. I'm not sure about, that's the edited book where Gladys has edited a book on bilingual education and deaf children, so following it up by reading if you want. And hopefully we will continue to discuss this idea further. It seems like a good opportunity to discuss co-enrolment in Scotland, so hopefully we will one day get a project going like that here. So thank you again, Antonella. You gave a really succinct account of your research, and I think really fascinating insight into how your own research has now branched out to include sign language research. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now, our next EdSign, I think we'll have to say we'll announce it. Our programme this year has not been totally organised in advance, as you will know, but we have got two ideas for the remainder of the year, and one of them is to have a walk on Arthur's Seat, focusing on geology signs, because you know there's been quite a lot of work going on at the Scottish Sensory Centre about the BSL glossary, and the geography signs are now launched. We actually have an app as well, which is going to launch soon. And we would like to do a walk, because we did a walk a few years ago, a history walk, which was tremendously popular. We had about 40 people from John Hay around Edinburgh. And this time we thought, well, they're at the foot of Arthur's Seat, why not go up there and have a look at the geology and talk about the geography, because we've got the signs produced by deaf geographers.
That's great.
So that is one prospect for June, and another one is another committee member would like to do some work with bringing up some deaf parents of deaf children to talk about very early exposure. We know they are in a more advantaged position in the sense that they can sign fluently from a young age, but looking at fluency in young deaf children. I'm not sure whether both of those things will come off, but we'll keep you updated by the usual channels, which is Facebook and the internet site. So thank you for coming, and I hope some of you who are online will perhaps come yourselves or watch, because I think we won't be able to do the walk. You'll have to come for that. Okay. Thank you very much for the interpreting and for the live streaming.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. Thanks for both of you.
That was great. Antonella was really good.
No, it would really be nice to work on this stuff. Gladys, I mean, one of the possibilities is that Gladys will take over the branch.
Oh, yes, remember that. Yes, there's a possibility.
There's a
Yes.
possibility.
Yeah.
The other possibility is that, you know, because I got